Welcome to Bitcoin Escape Plan. Bitcoin has been on a massive uptrend, but we are seeing the first signs of weakness on the chart. And in today's video, we're going to go over the key levels of support and resistance that we want to pay attention to have confirmation of whether this rally is over or whether we are just getting started after a brief pause. Later on in the video, we will go over the higher time frame, just so we have the historical context of how the price typically behaves this time of year and whether we are seeing a divergence or a confirmation of that trend. And at the very end of the video, I will go over these most recent 4-hour setups for the perpetual trades. If you are new to the channel, go ahead and check out bitcoinescapeplan.com. Every Monday, I release an in-depth newsletter to your email that breaks down all of the key levels that I talk about here on YouTube. I just say it ahead of time so you can have it for your week, separate from these videos that I release every Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. bitcoinescapeplan.com. Let's get into the video. All right. 4-hour analysis. Starting off, these are the two most important indicators that we have right now. If you're a fan of the channel already, you know what they are. If you are new to the channel, go ahead and check out these courses tabs up here. These are the anchored VWAPs. These are the middle bands of the downtrend anchored VWAP drawn from the 126 all-time high in October. And the middle band Elder VWAP. This one is drawn from the 2011 lows. In other words, the oldest lows that we have on the Bitstamp chart. So this one is showing us the price from the bottom. This one is showing us the price from the top. Very important that we're seeing kind of a tightening of that range. And as you can see, we failed our initial run towards the second one. This is something I've been talking about since February in all of my videos, and have initially broken back down below this middle band of the Elder VWAP. And as you can see, are struggling a little bit at the moment. Not convinced that this is a sign that we're going to drop considerably lower yet. I did have a client ask if they should have entered a short here, and obviously at this point, yes, the answer would have been correct. I think it's kind of tough, I'll go over this at the end of the video, it's kind of tough in a range like this where there are going to be trades that present themselves on the 4-hour chart. That's why I talk about the strategy all the time, is because it is reliable and because it does print. However, when we are sitting next to really, really important psychological levels, I think that it is sometimes smart to err on the side of caution, because the price can just as easily go the opposite direction of logic very quickly. So what are the key signs that we're going to see on the chart that'll indicate one way or the other? Well, again, the first one is just going to be this middle band of the Elder VWAP that's currently sitting at about 80.2K. And as you can see, we've spent a lot of time there over the last week, just trying to get confirmation from the price about whether or not we can move past this level. Now, again, this is a tool that I dropped on the chart on a candle in 2011, and I haven't touched it since, like I just listened to what that indicator is telling me. So we have a confirmation between that and then also this 80.5K pivot, which you can see as well. We are showing some signs of weakness and resistance at that 80.5K pivot. Super, super important level. As you can see as well, we have lost the 4-hour SMA. The 4-hour SMA has finally started to round out and curve back down. And as you can see as well, the bottom band of the Bollinger Band is starting to slope downward. So typically this would indicate a long. However, we are starting to see a little bit of weakness that could result in further downside. So again, this is why I was saying I think it is appropriate to take these scalps, because sometimes you're still going to be able to catch a quick little 10% move, assuming you're trading with leverage. However, the reality of where we are right now is we are at a key psychological level, and the price is going to behave rationally around that level unless we get clear confirmation. So what are some of those confirmation signals that we can look for? Well, one of them is going to be the anchored volume profile, another free tool in TradingView. And as you can see, we're very thin between about 72K to about 86K. Now what that means is that there are less living, breathing human beings with strong points of view about the price at these specific levels. We have a lot of people who have strong opinions about the price during 2025. We have a lot of people with strong opinions during the 2024 melt up, as well as the dip in 2025. However, we do not have enough people who are able to buy here, primarily because the price just ripped through these levels every time that it went past it, which we can see a little bit more clearly in the higher time frame analysis that we'll do in just a little bit. So the key levels that we want to pay attention to, again, we have our bottom band, middle band rather, of the Elder VWAP, which again, as you can see, we failed that, which means we're going to put pressure back towards this 79.4K Fibonacci pivot initially. And again, still sloping downward on the bottom band of the Bollinger Band. So there's not really anything preventing the price from continuing to open lower, especially with this 4-hour SMA dropping down. If we have a negative reaction to it, that's going to really push the price downward. So we should expect that for the moment, we started to see a bit of a loss of this momentum that we had before coming into this range. So there are a couple key things that are happening in terms of narratives that I believe are partially driving this. The most important one being on May 15th, Kevin Warsh officially takes over as the Federal Reserve Chair. This is very, very important. The market has been paying attention to this narrative pretty heavily since last year. So obviously it's going to be very important for us to see how the price reacts initially to that. I believe that there are two things happening with that. As far as I'm aware, most people are pricing in that they do not expect any more interest rate cuts for the rest of the year. However, they are simultaneously expecting as well that Kevin Warsh will eventually cut rates. This, from what I understand, is going to increase a period of stagflation, which means that the interest rates are going to continue to rise while they are also, trying to actively cut them. Which is going to end up kind of like crushing the economy or causing like a nuclear event in the economy, essentially a little bit later on in the year, that is going to force the Fed to have to print at an alarming rate. So if we think about it from a historical context, Bitcoin is actually reacting pretty well to that level of global uncertainty. A lot of what's happening as well with the Strait of Hormuz and the oil crisis, I think it's normal for Bitcoin to sell off in those types of events. It's normal for Bitcoin to chase after, like the stock market started behaving irrationally. So it's not strange that Bitcoin would catch a little bit of that momentum. However, we would expect at some point, if history is still holding true for Bitcoin itself, that we are currently on month number 3 in a row of a green candle. And we don't have any other instances of that in a bear market. It's not normal for us to see that in a bear market. Typically, what we will see is about 3 to 4 green candles total over the course of a bear market. So the fact that we are already seeing this many in a row is somewhat alarming, or at least something to pay close attention to. So really what we want to see is, are we getting similar momentum to other cycles? Now, this does not look exactly the same. Again, this one would have been green for us. This would have been, I believe, the February or March candle. Then we rose into April. And then June is where we started to show weakness and head down. We could be seeing something very, very similar here, where what we are waiting for is, we have a higher wick now on May already than we did for April. This is an important signal. Now, again, anyone who's already been following the channel, I talk about the 76.2K pivot in every single video since like February, essentially. This is the super, super important range that we need to get confirmation of as support or resistance before the price is really going to be able to take off and head higher, or need to retest lower. Now, a week ago, everyone was super, super bullish, and everyone was believing that we're going to head to 96 and higher, to 100K and higher. I see a lot of channels talking about this as a sincere possibility, is that we're about to see a 2019 situation where we just rip up early, essentially. My main problem with this is we haven't seen quite enough pain in this market, and I see that primarily reflected by this point in the chart right here. This is the ETFs. This is when they launch. This is when they start to go up. This is the major period of consolidation after a new local all-time high early prior to the halving itself. The halving is like April, May. The local high right there is in March. So we do not have an instance on the chart where the price behaves this way. So this is a bit of an anomaly. I believe that this is a big reason why the price didn't run as high as everyone hoped it did. It's because we already had a major all-time high set earlier on in the cycle. And then we hit our most important psychological one early on after the president was announced, where we hit 100K. So I think that that kind of like took out most of the steam. I talk about this a lot in the book that I wrote, but I believe that price is predominantly going to fixate around key levels that are easy for you to write down on a napkin. So 100K is way more important than 126. 126 does not matter. It's whipped cream on the sundae. 100K is the Sunday, so we really have to think about that in terms of each cycle. Is what is the important number? What is the important number that people are going to write newspapers about, that the news companies are going to continue to repeat over and over? This is how I knew last year when I kept seeing all the news stations say Bitcoin's never going below 100K, never going below 100K. They were saying that around here. I thought that was very strange, for them to go from they're pretty apprehensive about it, they're pretty much just reporting on it when the banks and everyone tells them, to being so emphatic that it's never going to go below 100K again. It's like, that's what, one, confirmed for me that 100K is a super important psychological level, and two, it confirmed for me that we were getting very close to the top and that we were going to start to go down lower. So for me, when I think about this particular narrative, I think about it in that way where, we're not just talking about a number on a chart anymore. We're talking about a number that belongs on billboards and that belongs in news headlines, and that literally determines whether or not people keep their job or not, is how well they're able to deliver this information. So for me, one of two things is going to happen. Either we make our way very close to it right now and still end up failing the monthly SMA, which again, we do not have an instance in history where we break back above the monthly SMA this quickly. We are getting very close. This is month number 6 that we are below this. The shortest period of time that we've seen a monthly SMA retest after breaking below it was about 7 months. So we could just be a month or two away from a sincere break of that could lead higher, or we see a rejection of it that does fail to the downside. Now we have to keep in context that the monthly Bollinger Band is still ascending. We are seeing a bit of compression here, not really enough compression to see this type of event quite yet. We want to see that continue to drop down and continue to melt up. However, that is very possible, is that we see a break of the cycle, because typically what we've seen so far, and this is very important for anyone who's like, they just like Bitcoin, but they're not like really up on the history. This is one of the first times where we're actually seeing a completion of the business cycle alongside Bitcoin itself. The last business cycle ending when Bitcoin was created, essentially. It was created with trying to protect people from the 2008 financial crisis. That's why Bitcoin was created. Literally in the Genesis block on January 3rd, 2009, it talks about the New York Times article that talks about the banks being bailed out by the people, essentially. That's what Bitcoin is for. It's designed to suck up that liquidity when the Fed prints a ton of money, which is what they will do later this year. And I think that's primarily going to come as a response, partially to the oil crisis, as well as that's going to put more pressure on consumer goods. It's going to start breaking things in the bond market, and eventually that always ends the same way. The Fed has to print. How are they going to do that? They're going to do that with the Stablecoin Acts. We're already seeing, I checked this earlier today, stablecoin inflows are continuing to be positive. However, the DAT inflows are a bit stronger than the ETF inflows, and the ETF inflows are negative at the moment. So I see a lot of people talking about that, about how the constant ETF and DAT flows are just going to continue to price Bitcoin higher and higher. There is truth to that. However, I think about this purely from a mathematical standpoint. This is a $1.6 trillion asset. The DATs are currently buying about $4 billion every 30 days. Now, this is just rudimentary math, but 4 times 12 is only 48 billion. And I know I say only 48 billion, but 1.6 trillion is considerably more than 48 billion. That is a chunk. And that's over the course of the full year. So I refuse to believe that that is going to be enough volume to keep the price going up forever. Like I don't think that it works that way. I understand why people are clinging on to whatever the narrative they can, because they want this time to be different. They want this to be up and to the right forever, because I guess it gets them more subscribers if that's the case. But for me, what I'm really looking at is the history. So what I would actually expect in this circumstance is that we start to show weakness at some point in May. Now, where is that going to present itself? I think that's going to present itself on the weekly chart first. So on the weekly chart now, we have our initial break of the weekly SMA over here. This is in the middle of April. We obviously get our first close above it. And then this candle, this one is super, super important. It broke all the way back down below the weekly Fibonacci pivot at 76.2K, as well as the weekly SMA itself, and was able to climb back and close just barely below this previous candle. So now we've seen essentially the same thing where this candle will close on Sunday. And we really want to see confirmation of how close does this candle get to this guy? Because if it gets much closer to this guy, we're going to fail at that point. It's going to start to break down at that point. And even in general, this is not the strongest looking candle. I'm not going to claim to you that I'm a candlestick expert. I am not. However, I have been talking about this momentum literally since like February. Since like February, I've been talking about like 83 to 86 is like the highest I can believe that we're going to go in this range. And where do we go to? We went right to 83 and had a reaction to it. Now you can see that represented very clearly here. This is the downtrend anchored VWAP, the middle band. This is on the higher time frame, but it essentially tells us the same thing as the lower one. But as you can see, pretty strong rejection of that initially, which is not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that this rally is completely over. However, we don't have very many instances where we retest the top band of the weekly SMA, specifically in a bear market. Let's go see if we have any evidence for that. So the closest one would be right here. That's the closest we get to the top band in 2022. If we go over to 2018, same thing, where the weekly SMA is kind of acting as a barrier to get to that top band of the weekly SMA. This is going to make more sense in just a second when I go back over it. And this is really the only other time where we have any evidence of a significant period of time where we are above the weekly SMA after initially breaking below it, is right here in 2014. Historically speaking, this is when the IRS makes Bitcoin legalized as property, as a commodity. Super, super important during that time. That ended up being a sell-off. It is my opinion that that is going to be what the Genius Act does this year, where we have a bullish Fed chair on May 15th, and then by the middle of July, two things are going to happen. One, they're going to have an MMA fight on the White House lawn, which is insane to me. That's a market top signal. The same way when they had tigers in the Olympic Coliseum or whatever, the Roman Coliseum, that was probably right before a major collapse in that society, at least if you zoom out far enough. And that is what I'm anticipating. It's not unreasonable to me that we can continue to rise into that news, because the news itself is very bullish. The stablecoin news itself is very bullish, that we're going to have basically like whatever the DATs and IBIT via their customers with BlackRock, whatever they're doing is going to be nothing compared to when the stablecoins fully ramp out. And I'm gonna stick with this for a second just so people can really understand what I'm talking about. So what is happening broadly, and we're actually seeing this happen across a number of different narratives. I don't really see people talking about it from this angle, but this is how I always think about it. Dear God, what did I click? I need to stop clicking too many buttons. How I always think about it is the stablecoins themselves essentially are a deal between the government and the banks. And what is that deal? What's happening with the government, and this is the US government that I'm talking about, is that other countries that have historically been the largest buyers of US debt are reducing their demand for US dollars, which means we need to find an equivalent buyer for that debt. Otherwise, it starts to put a lot of pressure on the dollar, and it starts to break down the bond market when there's not enough demand to fill out the treasury notes. So what they have done is the banks have made a deal with the government or vice versa. It doesn't really matter what they say in press releases. Functionally, what they're doing is they've gone and they've found their new buyer of US debt. Their new buyer of the US debt is the banks, because how the stablecoins work is for every $1 of a stablecoin that is issued, they need to hold $1 of US Treasury equivalent, whether that is a bond or just flat cash. Doesn't really matter. They have to have that in order to back these stable coins. So what that effectively means, and I don't know why I don't hear anyone talking about this. I'm the only one that talks about this in this way. But what that essentially means is that like the Fed is going to turn anyone who has a JP Morgan Chase or Citi or Wells Fargo or any of these banks, any of them that want to settle in stable coins, they're turning those people into like reverse ATMs, basically, where in order to sustain the demand for US dollar debt, they are now turning everyone on the planet who uses a bank account into a buyer of the debt. Instead of having to go to the government of Japan, the government of China, the government of Russia, now it is the citizens of the world that are using these bank accounts to get access to these stable coins, which are going to be faster than having to send wire transfers. Unfortunately, based on how the Genius Act is being written at the moment, we're going to lose out on stablecoin yield, which is not a victory for crypto companies. I'm sure most of you watching this have at some point used yield farming or staking or something. Not a victory for us to see that we have no yield on these stable coins. And how the banks are actually going to do it is they're going to prioritize you spending them. They're going to give you bonuses for spending X amount of stable coins. Why? Because the US government needs to buy treasury bills. They need buyers of the treasury bills in order for the whole thing not to collapse. So one of the other things that I think is super important that I don't hear people talking about with the Strait of Hormuz is that they are accepting Bitcoin for barrels of oil. This is something I've been talking about for years. I think that's going to be a critical inflection point, is when we start to see barrels of oil priced and accepted in Bitcoin instead of US dollars. That's another serious hindrance on the US dollar itself that is going to result to the upside in Bitcoin. So we need to keep that context in mind, is at a certain point, this chart is going to break and we are just going to go up and to the right. And that is very important, and I don't harp on this too much in this channel, but I have not sold the majority of my spot Bitcoin position. I am still hoping, and me personally, I still believe we're going to touch 60K again at least one more time this year. And at that time, I'm going to have to put whatever cash I can at that moment, because I don't know if we're going to get lower than that this time. It's not very clear. So the only points of evidence that we have for whether we are going to continue or whether we are done for now is we don't have another instance where we touch the top band of the weekly Bollinger Band during a bear market. We don't have an instance for that. We don't have an instance for that until we have fully flipped over in a new market cycle. This is very important as well. This is one of the first times we've had quantitative easing alongside a bear market. So there is possibility that we go higher than we typically would. However, we still would not expect it to hit that top band of the weekly Bollinger Band, which again means that the price can't even get to 96K. And 96K is really what we need to see to confirm that we are in a quote unquote bull market and that we are, back to higher prices. So for me, it is hard for me to believe, one, that we're going to get that far away from the weekly SMA. Because even in the one instance where we have that, which again is 2014, completely different global landscape, way smaller asset class. Again, the only relevant thing here is the Mt. Gox collapse, which I wouldn't say is a bullish signal at all. And then the classification as property by the IRS, super important there. But even in that instance, we're only 14% off of the weekly SMA at that time, and we don't stay there the whole time. As you can see, we're mostly range bound at that time, and it's primarily around the $600 level at that time, which is also important. Why? Because we ended up going to the 6K level, is the important level in 2019. And now what we're seeing This is slightly higher, not quite as clean for this one, but now what we're seeing is 60K is reflected as that. So we had 600 that was important in a previous cycle, 6,000 that was important in a previous cycle, and 60,000 now that is important in this cycle. So again, I talk about this all the time. Bitcoin is math, not just money. We have to pay attention sometimes to how the price behaves at just, key magnifications of previous important price levels. So what that means is I would expect the price to return there at a certain point and probably break below it. It is also not a complete market cycle unless these ETF buyers experience pain. If those ETF buyers do not have to experience more pain than this 4 to 8 week period earlier in the year, then there's nothing to make them panic and sell or buy more. They're not going to FOMO in here the same way that they would if it drops below, and they have to make a sincere decision of, do I keep this asset? Do I rotate to gold or the S&P or real estate or whatever? If there's no hard decision point, then I don't think that we have seen a complete market cycle. Now, we didn't see a top in euphoria as we would typically expect as well, so that could also impair our ability to have basically a clear signal of whether we are going higher or about to drop lower. But the weekly SMA, I think, is going to be one of the clearest signals that we have for that. The weekly SMA is currently just barely below the 76.2K Fibonacci pivot, which again means that what we are waiting for confirmation of is when we retest this, and we will. I don't think that we're going to, for me, it's less likely that we just shoot through 86K and higher than it is that while we're showing some weakness here, that's probably going to bring us back to at least a retest of 76.2K. And then that's either going to decide that we have a retest with the weekly again, or that we do not. And we just continue higher. But again, that'll be pretty clear based on this down test back to 76.2K, wherever the weekly SMA is. Now, the weekly SMA has not started to completely consolidate and round out yet, or God forbid, flip back to the upside. We have not seen that. We are still seeing it descend, although a little bit less sharply than it had been. But that's going to be the main thing I think that'll give us confirmation of trend, is that weekly SMA. So what we want to look for, and I'll talk about this in Sunday's video, I will confirm it in Monday's video. Like and subscribe if you are enjoying the content. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions. But that's what we're going to want to see, is confirmation of that. I would imagine, since we're showing a little bit of weakness on this momentum here, I would imagine we're going to retest it sometime next week or the week after. The only thing that could really shift that is if we have, super, super bullish positive news around the Kevin Warsh announcement on the 15th. It's my understanding he doesn't have a meeting until June. So maybe there's just some other initial press conference that he's going to have where people are still going to glean information from that. But for the most part, I do think that we don't have that much more room to run. Again, I've talked about this in every video since January, February. I can believe 86K. I can believe it. There's nothing to me that is preventing the price from rising that high, other than, again, this middle band of the downtrend anchored VWAP, which is not a guarantee that the price can't go above it. But look what happens. We had a failure there and we broke down pretty hard. So if we're seeing a failure here, what we would expect next is to break down pretty hard. So the only thing that's going to really prevent that is, again, we have this important level of support and resistance here in 2025, which is essentially just kind of like an early signal of levels that we needed to pay attention to this year. So that's what we're waiting to see. Is that support or resistance? Same as this support or resistance? At the moment, this is support. At the moment, this is unclear whether it is support or resistance, and it's starting to look a little bit like resistance. It's too early to call. I really think that it'll be probably by the middle of May or slightly later into May that we actually have confirmation of this. So what does that mean for you at the moment with your trades? Me personally, I am not in any trades at the moment. However, as I said earlier on in the video, there's really nothing wrong with adding exposure to some of these scalps, because this would have been a nice little payday. This would have been about a 30-40% trade. Nothing wrong with that at all. It's just trying to catch a short in the middle of a bull market. I am still, I would say, again, I'm not in any positions right now, but I am still, I would say, bullish until we get a confirmation of 83 or 86. And I don't know that this is enough confirmation, 82.8. I don't know that that's enough confirmation of a failure of 83 at the moment. And really what we want to see, as I said earlier in the video, is we want to see strength at 79.4K to confirm that we have another bounce higher, or acceptance at that level that we are then going to break down lower towards 77.6. And realistically, to me, there's nothing that really prevents the price towards heading back towards 73.8K at that point, other than, you know, this local support. It's possible we stop at 76, 78, and 80 are all very important. So there's nothing really preventing the price from pausing there and potentially bouncing. But that is like realistically where we're at. Is we are past the super important level. The super important level is 73.8K and 80K. So those are the most important psychological levels, and everything else is just kind of like, you know, a little bit of extra color or a little bit of extra data as we're moving. So we did just see, this is a long technically. Now at the moment, it's not a crazy long. Go away, Sticky Keys. You're not helping me. That's only about whatever, like a 12% trade with 10x leverage on the Coinbase BTC perpetual contracts, which is what I trade personally. And again, we would already probably want to be out of that at the moment by how it's looking. I think because this Bollinger Band is continuing to expand to the downside, and that is what we are seeing right now. We have seen compression and we are starting to see expansion, and it looks like that expansion is to the downside, not the upside. So what we're looking for at the moment, if this momentum is going to continue, which again, I'm not totally convinced of. It doesn't really matter to me. As I said, I have exposure to Bitcoin either way, so I'm not really stressed about it. Just waiting to see if there's an opportunity to buy more, or whether I have to accept that it's going to continue to go lower, which is the opportunity to buy more. But that's kind of what we have to keep in our minds is, does it make more sense? And this is how I think about it. Does it make more sense for JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, everybody else? Does it make more sense for them to get more of their customers to spend an irrational amount of money on Bitcoin if Bitcoin is at elevated prices? Or do those financial institutions make more money if the price of Bitcoin is lower when they are fully onboarded everything? Which, as far as I'm aware, is January of 2027. Now, does it happen a little bit earlier than that? Yes, potentially. We're already seeing like private companies like Tether and Circle are benefiting initially from the Stablecoin Act because they're already working, you know. But the amount of volume that they are going to put into the market compared to something, you know, like a JP Morgan Chase is paltry. You know, we're not talking, I mean, Morgan Stanley is a big one. That is super important. You know, they're like, whatever, like $12 trillion plus that they're managing. So highly important about that one. But I don't necessarily think it is uniform that there's a major announcement about them offering Bitcoin and then it immediately goes up and to the right. We did see that with the IBIT ETF. So it's possible that Morgan Stanley just has enough clients interested in Bitcoin where it does push us higher. However, again, historically speaking, what we expect to see this time of year is a failure of the weekly SMA and not a retest of the monthly. You know, normally we would see a more significant breakdown. And in past cycles, we didn't have our breakdown of the monthly as early as we have it now. So again, that's the primary thing that we need to keep in mind, is we broke earlier than we typically would, which theoretically means we're going to break back above it earlier than we typically would. So that's pretty much one of two things is going to happen. You know, we're seeing this continue to curve up, which has not happened that many times. Typically speaking, we would expect it to flatten and potentially start rounding down. However, with it continuing to rise, this being the monthly SMA, that does put some pressure or allowance for the price to go higher during that time period. And that's pretty much what we're waiting for, is do we have any significant resistance form at the 86K level that would require us to start heading back downward. And again, just for full transparency, this is a green candle at the moment. The only thing that needs to push it below to make it a red candle is a close below 76.3K. Now we have the whole rest of the month for that to happen. And again, it's very easy for us to potentially see weakness on the weekly the second that we start to retest back towards that Fibonacci pivot. And again, if we test back towards that Fibonacci pivot and also have a negative reaction of the weekly SMA, that is a double failure that is not going to make the price excited. That is going to make the price head back initially towards 73.8K, right after that towards 70.3K. And if we can't get strength at either of those levels, then we would expect the price to trend back towards 64 and 60K. So me personally, the main things that I'm paying attention to are what happens around the Fed chair announcement. Is there significant price movement around May 15th? That's why I keep saying that as the title in the videos. That's an important date to watch. If there's any changes with the situation with the Strait of Hormuz, that is going to be reflected in the chart as well. Probably bullish initially. And again, I do think that there's a possibility that we can still rise to at least 86K. And there's nothing really preventing it from wicking a little bit higher than that. It's just hard for me to believe it's going to consistently close above that, just based on how the price has behaved at that point in previous attempts and breakthroughs. And again, this is what I was talking about, where we just kind of ripped through this price the other times, is we don't spend a ton of time at these levels. That's why it's so thin, is because we ripped through here, consolidated there a little bit, but pretty much, the price doesn't want to stay in these levels. It wants to know, are we going higher or are we going lower? And unfortunately, my friends, I can't give you the answer to that, and nobody can. So me personally, that's what I'm focused on. I'm waiting a little bit before I re-enter my trade. I would imagine I will be entering a short at that point in time. Really kind of going to be decided by if we start to see weakness on the daily. This is an important thing to end out on. We've been having a lot of strength on the daily since early April. Even had a retest towards the end of April that still resulted to the upside. So that's what we would be expecting to look at now, is do we start to see enough weakness to bring us back to the daily SMA? And then again, that's going to be a very clear signal. Okay, we've lost the daily SMA. Now we have some momentum to the downside. And if we do lose that, then that is also going to be in alignment with losing momentum on the weekly. And then very quickly we switch from, you're going to be seeing videos that are bearish again instead of bullish. And there's not really any reason why everyone can't just get chopped out during this period. That's what I'm saying. Like, me personally, I'm not in any perpetuals until I get clear confirmation of, are we going lower or higher? It's better to be patient, I think, sometimes than to get chopped out in this range. If you're following this channel, I've been pretty accurate during this range, just kind of calling out how it's going to behave, but it's not always like that. Sometimes it is much harder to predict, and we have to accept that we are in a paradigm now where we may be seeing something different on the chart than we typically have, and we just have to accept that. So that's what I'm looking at for the moment. I'll update you guys again on Sunday and Monday's videos. Go ahead, check out bitcoinescapeplan.com. Subscribe over there and here. Thank you so much. I'll see you on Sunday.